Legendary voices don't usually fade quietly. They echo, tremble, and leave rooms colder after they're gone. Legendary hearts don't just stop. They leave unanswered questions behind, questions that ache long after the applause dies. Legendary lives, especially ones that began in the spotlight, often end with shadows no one knows how to explain. There was a moment when America believed it knew Ricky Nelson completely. He was the smiling boy on television, the clean-cut dream in black-and-white living rooms, the son everyone trusted because he felt like family. Week after week, people watched him grow up on screen, watched his voice deepen, watched his charm harden into something cooler, something more dangerous, something closer to rock and roll rebellion. And yet beneath that familiar face was a life slowly tightening like a knot, pulled by expectations, fame, silence, and a quiet loneliness no audience ever applauded. Ricky was born into show business before he ever had a choice. Ozzie and Harriet Nelson didn't just raise a son, they raised a symbol, a carefully lit image of American perfection. Cameras followed him before he could understand what privacy meant. Scripts shaped his childhood. Laughter tracks hid the moments when things felt wrong. By the time he learned to ride a bike, he had already learned how to perform. By the time he learned to sing, millions were listening. And when his records began climbing the charts, when girls screamed his name the way they screamed Elvis Presley's, Ricky smiled because that's what he was trained to do. But fame, especially inherited fame, is a strange illness. It doesn't arrive suddenly, it settles into the bones. Friends later said Ricky carried a weight that didn't match his youth, a pressure to stay frozen in time while the world demanded he grow and change at the same time. When he sang, there was joy, but there was also something fragile in his voice, something searching. He wanted to be taken seriously as a musician, not just a television kid who got lucky. He wanted the respect that Johnny Cash earned, the edge that Bob Dylan was praised for, the freedom to fail and reinvent himself. Instead, he felt trapped by the image that made him famous. As the years passed, the smiles became harder to maintain. The industry that once adored him began to turn its back, whispering that he was outdated, too clean, too tied to his parents' legacy. Concert crowds shifted, applause softened, and Ricky felt the sting of rejection in a way that cut deeper because it came after love. He sang about heartbreak, but he also lived it. Friends noticed changes in his health, in his energy, in the way his eyes seemed tired even when he was laughing. There were rumors of illness, of exhaustion, of a man pushing himself to prove he still mattered. Family pain sat quietly in the background. Ozzie, once the steady voice of reassurance, grew older and more distant, his own regrets never fully spoken. Harriet worried in ways mothers do when they sense their child is slipping beyond reach. Ricky loved them deeply, yet resented the cage he felt they helped build. That conflict stayed buried, unspoken, a silence heavier than any argument. At night after shows, he would sit alone, guitar in hand, playing songs that never made it to the radio, songs filled with doubt and longing. Then came the final tour, the sense that something was wrong but no one knew how wrong. Friends later recalled moments that felt off, strange comments, tired smiles that lingered too long. Ricky spoke about the past more than usual, about mistakes, about wanting to be remembered for who he really was. There were last phone calls that sounded ordinary at the time, words that only became haunting afterward. No one recognized them as "geez, oh goodbyes," because no one wanted to imagine that ending. When tragedy struck, it arrived suddenly, violently, without warning, leaving shock where certainty once lived. The headlines tried to explain it, but explanations only raised more questions. Fans mourned, families broke, and Hollywood went quiet in that specific way it does when it knows something doesn't add up. Whispers followed the official story, doubts passed from one voice to another, and the sense that pieces were missing refused to disappear. Even now, decades later, people still ask what Ricky Nelson was trying to say before he was gone, what pain he carried in silence, and whether the world truly listened. His songs still play, his face still smiles from old footage, but the mystery remains, hovering between memory and regret, waiting to be understood. Beloved. Ricky Nelson had always been a performer first, a man second. And in those final years, that distinction became almost unbearably clear. The stage was both a refuge and a trap. He thrived under the lights, feeding off the audience's energy. But when the applause ended, when the dressing rooms emptied and the road stretched on into the night, he was left with questions only he could hear. Friends noticed him staring at nothing, as if the past and future were both pressing down at the same time. There were nights when he refused to eat, or when he drank too much coffee, trying to chase away the shadows he couldn't name. And yet, he always smiled when the cameras were rolling, always hit the notes, always gave the fans what they came for, because giving up was not something Ricky Nelson ever learned to do. Hollywood insiders whisper that Ricky had begun confiding in a small circle of people, other musicians who understood the peculiar blend of fame and fear, like Carl Perkins, and later, even a worn-out Elvis Presley, who knew what it meant to live in a gilded cage. They spoke late at night about regrets, about the opportunities missed, and about the suffocating weight of expectation. Ricky wanted to break free, but there was a guilt that tied him to his legacy, a sense that if he abandoned the path laid out for him, he would be abandoning the people who believed in him. That internal tug-of-war became a rhythm in his life, a pattern of hope and despair. The family tension intensified behind the closed doors of Beverly Hills estates. Ozzy, despite decades of show business mastery, could not fully reach the man his son had become. Harriet, protective and loving, often caught herself holding her breath, hoping Ricky wouldn't push too far, but also wanting him to find his own voice. There were arguments that nobody heard, tears that were swallowed in private, moments of emotional breakdowns when Ricky realized he was both a son and a prisoner, a performer and a man longing for normalcy. He wanted to be seen for who he truly was, not the public image polished and packaged since childhood. His marriage and personal relationships bore the strain of this invisible burden. Friends recall tense dinners, quiet sobbing in hotel rooms, and moments of intimacy shadowed by doubt. Ricky's charm, which had drawn millions, could not shield him from the vulnerability that came with being known by everyone, yet understood by no one. Some of his closest confidants tried to intervene, offering help, advice, or just a listening ear, but Ricky often refused, insisting that he had to face his demons alone. There was a pride in him, a stubbornness, but it came at a cost. Health rumors began to swirl, not just casual speculation but observations from those who toured with him. There were mentions of fatigue, chest pains, sleepless nights filled with pacing, and scribbled notes for songs that may never be recorded. Yet, despite it all, Ricky kept performing, kept chasing the elusive promise of validation. Those who saw him on stage in those final months said, his eyes betrayed a deeper story, a combination of exhaustion, sorrow, and a desperate clinging to the life he had fought so hard to create. Yes, every chord he struck, every harmony he sang, carried an unspoken confession, a code for anyone willing to listen closely enough. And then there were the flights, the constant traveling that seemed mundane but in hindsight carried an undercurrent of danger. Close friends now admit they were uneasy about his plans, the schedules that seemed too tight, the pilots who looked rushed, the planes that felt too small for the weight he carried. Ricky himself never spoke openly about fear, but in private, he acknowledged a vulnerability few ever witnessed. It was a kind of quiet desperation, a man racing against time, against fate, and perhaps against himself. By the time the last night came, Ricky had already become a puzzle, pieces scattered across decades of family, and personal battles. The plane ride, the final show, the smiles for fans. All of it now reads like the final act of a man who never got the closure he longed for. Those closest to him later described the day as ordinary in moments, extraordinary in hindsight, filled with laughter, planning, and an eerie calm. And in that calm, there were tiny, almost imperceptible warnings, signs that something was amiss, but the world was too busy applauding to notice. The shock of the tragedy ripped through Hollywood and the music world like a hurricane. Reports came fast, conflicting, leaving fans desperate for answers, journalists scrambling for explanations. The official story tried to piece together the sequence of events, but gaps remained. Whispers grew louder, and the sense of mystery deepened. What had happened in the hours before the crash? What conversations had been left unfinished? What fears had he carried silently? That no one would ever truly know. Even now, these questions linger, haunting the legacy of a man who seemed invincible, yet was heartbreakingly human. Respected Ricky Nelson had left hopes, and more than just songs. He left a trail of unanswered questions, a labyrinth of what-ifs and hearts heavy with if-onlys. The immediate aftermath of his death was chaos framed in grief. Family members struggled not only with the incomprehensible shock, but with the weight of public scrutiny. The Nelson name, once synonymous with wholesome Americana, was suddenly etched into headlines filled with speculation and rumor. Harriet clung to her memories, Ozzie retreated behind his stoic facade, and the children, then young adults, were left to piece together a father they thought they knew. Friends described a tension so thick it could be felt in every room, the tension between public mourning and private confusion. Those who had toured with Ricky spoke reluctantly, often in half-confessions, revealing secrets they had been sworn to protect. One musician recalled Ricky joking about fate during a late-night sound check, a dark humor that now felt prophetic. Another remembered the way he held back from flying certain smaller aircraft, preferring the safer, larger planes, a choice he couldn't always make due to scheduling pressures. Each recollection layered the story with a haunting sense of inevitability, a feeling that tragedy had been creeping toward him in subtle, nearly invisible ways, long before the headlines broke. Hollywood, ever hungry for narratives, began to spin theories, some grounded in fact, some veiled in sensationalism. There were whispers of mechanical failure, weather conditions, pilot fatigue, and the relentless pressure of performance schedules. Yet amid the speculation, an unsettling silence persisted. Details that could have clarified the truth were lost or never revealed. Friends and family would later hint that Ricky had been unusually reflective in the days before the final flight, speaking with a tenderness and melancholy that suggested he sensed the fragility of the world around him. His last conversations, now dissected line by line, sounded like fragments of a farewell, subtle yet devastatingly real. Even as the official reports were released, inconsistencies and contradictions fueled a quiet obsession among fans. They scrutinized interviews, reread news articles, examined recordings from the tour, searching for clues that might explain what had happened. Some pointed to his workload, noting the relentless pace of his performances and travels as a pressure cooker. Others focused on his health, insisting that subtle signs of exhaustion or stress had gone unnoticed. Through it all, the tragedy of his death became a mirror reflecting the larger struggles of fame itself, the way it protects, isolates, and demands perfection, even in the most human moments. The emotional impact on family and close friends was profound. Some broke down in private, tears flowing for the child who had always seemed larger than life, but was, in truth, achingly vulnerable. Others struggled with guilt, questions of whether more could have been done, whether warning signs had been missed, or whether protective instincts had failed. Music historians and contemporaries, including surviving members of Ricky's touring bands and fellow performers who had seen him at his most candid, later admitted that Ricky's inner battles were often invisible to outsiders. He had perfected the art of concealing pain behind charm and laughter, leaving those closest to him to decode the silent messages hidden in lyrics, glances, and quiet moments. Behind the scenes, his unreleased recordings hinted at the depths of his struggle. Songs written but never published, lyrics scribbled on napkins, fragments of melodies recorded in hotel rooms. All these suggested a man wrestling with identity, legacy, and mortality. Music insiders who had gained access to these tapes spoke of a raw vulnerability, a confessional tone that revealed fears and regrets Ricky could never voice on stage. There were references to isolation, to eflao, eating love, to the crushing weight of expectation, and even to fleeting thoughts of mortality that were unsettlingly candid. These works, hidden from the public eye for decades, offered a glimpse into the private Ricky, fragile, defiant, and profoundly human. Even decades later, fans remain captivated, compelled to revisit the story not merely because of his music, but because of the mystery he left behind. Interviews with surviving contemporaries, once sparse and guarded, now reveal moments of intense closeness, where Ricky confided in those he trusted the most. He spoke of mistakes he could never undo, choices he regretted, and dreams that felt perpetually out of reach. And while his public persona radiated confidence, behind closed doors he admitted insecurities that resonated deeply with anyone who had ever felt the pressure to perform, to please, or to hide pain beneath a smile. As the Nelson family sought closure, they discovered that even the truth itself could be elusive. Documents, flight logs, and recordings offered pieces of the puzzle, but the complete picture remained tantalizingly just out of reach. Every new revelation raised more questions. Had Ricky sensed danger and tried to shield those around him? Were their warnings ignored, misread, or simply invisible? And in the quiet moments when no one else was watching, the unanswered questions pressed down, a haunting reminder of a life lived in both brilliance and shadow. Legendary Ricky Nelson's story didn't end the night of the crash. In many ways, it only deepened, folding into decades of speculation, grief, and hidden truths that the public could never fully grasp. Friends who had been with him on tour recalled small, telling details in the days before the tragedy. How he lingered on conversations, how he seemed unusually contemplative, almost hesitant, as if weighing invisible choices. One close see. Confidant remembered Ricky staring out of a hotel window, whispering to no one, "I just wish I could get it right before it all ends." At the time, it seemed like idle musings, the kind of fleeting reflection anyone might have before a performance. Looking back, those words carry a chilling weight, like the final chords of a song you only understand once it's over. The music world reeled not only from his death, but from the realization that so much of his inner life remained hidden. There were interviews he never gave, letters never mailed, and songs never recorded, pieces of a puzzle that might have revealed his fears, regrets, and deepest desires. Musicians who knew him spoke quietly about his perfectionism and the private battles he fought against time, fame, and his own conscience. There was a tenderness to him few ever witnessed, and a darkness he guarded even more fiercely. One veteran roadie later admitted that Ricky often confided about sleepless nights, fears that he wasn't living up to his own expectations, and the crushing weight of a public that demanded he remain timeless. Hollywood insiders, too, began to piece together the unseen pressures. Ricky's connections with contemporaries like Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley were more than casual friendships. They were lifelines to men who understood the duality of fame and personal torment. Ricky spoke privately about the anxiety of constantly performing a version of himself, of living in a light that never dimmed, and of the impossibility of ever stepping off the stage without judgment. In those quiet moments, he revealed insecurities that would have shocked his fans, doubts about his talent, fears about disappointing loved ones, and regrets about moments in his personal life he could never undo. The Nelson family, too, wrestled with their own private tragedies. Ozzy, stoic and disciplined, struggled to reconcile the image of the invincible son on screen with the vulnerable man he had raised. Harriet carried the weight of a mother who had guided her son through a world that could be both enchanting and cruel, only to watch him taken from her far too soon. Ricky's children faced the dual burden of grief and legacy, of understanding a father through archival footage and fragmented recollections, of piecing together the man behind the myth. Family gatherings were often tinged with melancholy, a constant reminder of what was lost and what questions remained unanswered. Rumors persisted about aspects of his life that Hollywood rarely documented. The quiet struggles with health, whispered arguments with management, fleeting friendships that ended abruptly, and moments of reckless adventure that hinted at a man testing limits. Some stories spoke of near misses, of flights canceled at the last minute, of instincts that seemed prophetic but went unheeded. Others told of heartbreaks and fleeting romances, experiences he lived fully but kept private, preserving an image that often masked the complexity beneath. Every layer uncovered only seemed to deepen the mystery of who Ricky really was. And through it all, the music endured. Songs that had once felt like light-hearted pop now carry a resonance of melancholy, hints of private truths embedded in harmonies and lyrics. Fans play the records, watch old television appearances, and search for moments where the mask slips, where the boy behind the legend might reveal himself. Scholars and historians dissect every detail, uncovering fragments of conversations and diary entries, and each new discovery feels like another brush with a man who lived too fully, too publicly, and yet was still misunderstood. Even today, decades later, the story of Ricky Nelson is a study in contrasts. Brilliant, yet fragile, adored yet isolated, celebrated yet mourned. Those who knew him well often describe a man who, despite fame and fortune, carried a profound humanity, an awareness of mortalities, a sensitivity to life's injustices, and a longing to be remembered not just for the songs he sang, but for the truth of who he was. And it is in that lingering duality, between legend and man, between stage persona and private self, that the mystery continues, leaving fans to wrestle with the questions he never had the chance to answer. Beloved, Ricky Nelson's story is threaded with moments of beauty and heartbreak so tightly wound that even those closest to him often couldn't separate them. Friends spoke of evenings where he would sit alone, strumming his guitar long after the roadies had gone, whispering lyrics no one would ever hear, eyes distant, fingers trembling with both talent and worry. In those moments, the carefully constructed persona fell away, leaving behind a man grappling with impermanence, legacy, and a private sorrow few could understand. There were glimpses of vulnerability, a sudden tear during rehearsal, a quivering voice when speaking of family, a quiet laugh that seemed to mask a deeper unease. These moments became legend among those who witnessed them, whispered like a secret only the walls of the hotels and concert halls knew. Hollywood, ever hungry for sensationalism, never quite understood the depth of Ricky's inner life. To them, he was either the boy on TV, the teen idol, or the rock and roll star, never the complicated human being behind the microphone. There were stories, sometimes true, sometimes exaggerated, of disagreements with producers, of tension with bandmates, of personal demons fought quietly. Yet Ricky carried it all with a measured grace, choosing often to retreat rather than explode, to smile rather than confront, to perform rather than reveal. Those who knew him best say he bore these struggles alone, shielding others from the weight of his fears. Family dynamics only added to the complexity. Ozzie and Harriet, the guiding forces of Ricky's early life, provided structure and opportunity, but their fame and the world they created also left little room for Ricky's personal growth. Conflicted loyalty ran through every decision he made, loyalty to his family, to the fans, and to himself. And the collision of these forces often left him exhausted, emotionally fractured. Private arguments would flare and fade, tears were shed in silence, and apologies were often swallowed before they could be spoken aloud. There were nights when he admitted to feeling trapped, caught between gratitude and guilt, love and suffocation. Ricky's personal relationships mirrored this turbulence. Marriages, friendships, and fleeting romances were marked by moments of genuine tenderness, but also by misunderstandings, miscommunications, and a restless energy that made permanence difficult. Some who knew him describe him as magnetic, able to light up any room, yet simultaneously unknowable, a man who could draw people close, and yet remain just out of reach. Lovers remembered nights of whispered confessions, jokes that veiled despair, and a profound sensitivity to the world's cruelties. In these intimate corners of his life, Ricky's humanity shone brightest, and most painfully. The tour preceding his final days was, in retrospect, a mixture of triumph and tension. Every performance was perfect, yet every flight, every hotel, every late-night rehearsal seemed to carry an invisible weight. Crew members recall unusual fatigue in Ricky, subtle remarks about risk, and fleeting, almost imperceptible hints that he sensed fragility, his own and that of the circumstances around him. Yet true to form, he never showed fear to the audience, never admitted to doubt, never relinquished the stage, leaving everyone who witnessed him both awed and unaware of the storm beneath the surface. Then there were the what-ifs that haunted the aftermath. Investigators, historians, and fans alike tried to trace the minute-by-minute details of that final flight. Every twist, every maneuver, every oversight, or perhaps unavoidable accident was analyzed, dissected, and debated. And yet, even with modern technology and hindsight, questions remained. Could it have been prevented? Were warnings ignored? Was there an element of fate, or simply misfortune? Family members and friends wrestled with these questions privately, the weight of them pressing harder because they could never truly be answered. In the quiet spaces left by his absence, Ricky Nelson's legend grew, not only for the music, but for the mystery, the tragedy, and the emotional truth that lingered in the shadows. Every record, every old television clip, every fan memory became part of a mosaic that was as painful as it was beautiful. His life, marked by brilliance and burden, became a testament to the complexity of fame and the human heart, leaving those who loved him, and even strangers who admired him, haunted by both wonder and sorrow.